Welcome, everyone, to the C-Suite Sales and Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we have a very special guest on, Michael Scott. Now, Michael, a couple of things that are really interesting about you and your background and your career. So you're a chief revenue officer, and you've spent your career marketing to marketers. Talk about a skeptical group. Talk about a group that's really hard to convince and convert. I got to tell you, I got to give you a lot of kudos for lasting that long and not having more gray hairs, right? So, but what's interesting about that is throughout that, you've worked with big public companies, startups, you've had your own company before, you've looked at it from an entrepreneurial perspective, and you really got to understand your audience. We all do, right? But as a chief revenue officer, you have to also translate that into a go-to-market strategy. And that's where today. We're going to talk about the revenue logic of customer obsession. And we all know that the customer is our North Star, right? But less than 3% of business companies, business to business companies are actually customer obsessed. And that's a Forrester study. And those that are have, I got to get these numbers right, 41% faster revenue growth, 49% faster profit growth, and 51% better retention. So from kind of an umbrella area, we know the customers are North Star. We know it impacts the revenue of our business, but very few of us do it. And we got to unpack why and how you think about that. But before we dive in, I'd love to give you an opportunity to maybe expand a little bit more on your background before we get started.
Yeah, Steve. First off, thanks for having me today. I'm absolutely delighted to talk about this. Some of my favorite topics. And yes, I've had a career of, as I've said, marketing to marketers, basically working I think I've worked in organizations where we've sold just about every marketing solution, maybe with the exception of, no, I actually did newspaper when I was in college. So yeah, just about everything, the old newsprint. So it can go back a ways. This is a fantastic topic. I've really loved advertising and marketing and media since I think I probably was in my teen years, and it really drove where I went to school and how I thought about my career and things like that. I'm really passionate about the space. I'm really passionate about, data, digital, media, video. These are places that I've spent my entire career and partnering with exceptional customers on that side.
Here's what I'd love to do. I'd love to just start out and ask, when we say a statement like the title of this episode, the revenue logic of customer obsession, how do you state the revenue logic of customer obsession? Like, how do you make that connection yourself?
Yeah, I think it's about really understanding your customer and understanding your own space about where you fit in their mindset and their solution stack or architecture, and where you can continue to provide value. Because if you provide value and that value is recognized on the other side, obviously value turns into revenue, and that's the logic. Theory going that the better you know your customer, the more you can be a trusted partner, advisor to them, the more you can find problems that you're uniquely positioned to solve, which then creates value, and that value can be extracted or turned into revenue. So I think that's how I think about the chain of our today's conversation. The question is, who owns it? How widespread is it in the organization? How much is it of a fabric of the organization? Those are some of the things that I think are a bit interesting for us to discuss today.
All right, well, you just laid out our next three questions. So
Right.
Who owns it, right? Who owns customer obsession, right? B2C companies, they have chief customer officers, chief experience officers, and B2B, we kind of don't. And I don't know why, right? Because we're adopting more and more of the expectations from the B2C world in B2B. Who does own customer obsession inside of an organization, and how should that work?
Well, I mean, one would say that everybody owns it, but then there's a saying, when everybody owns it, no one really owns it, right? So
Yeah.
certainly people closest to the customers should own it. Usually it's in the revenue organization, and usually that's a partnerships team or a sales team, somebody who's sitting in there and can really dig into the customer obsession for that, and the ownership of that. I would also argue that it's a C-suite ownership opportunity as well, right? So it's not just the chief revenue officer, but how are we thinking about staffing through the chief people officer? How are we thinking about our product architecture with a chief product officer? How are we thinking about the financial incentives around the customers and how we're driving that? How does it become everybody's, as you said, North Star? But ultimately, I think everybody is going to sit in that room and they're going to look down the table at the person who has revenue in their title and go, how should we be thinking about our customers? It's the orientation of getting out of the silo, I would say, and really orienting everybody's view towards how does what I do today in my organization provide value for our customer, not just working through kind of the roles and responsibilities that we have, but what are we doing today that's going to add value to the relationship that we have with our customers?
So, how we go about learning, right? And so here's a broad generalization, but I've said it to about 100 different C-suite executives. I've never gotten massive pushback, but I'd love to get your thought on this. We tend to learn about the customer from just going through our normal go-to-market strategy, right? We've got sellers that are talking to prospects every day. We're learning, right? The thing that's happening there is they're waiting longer and longer to want to even talk to us, right? They're making the vast majority of their decisions. They're thinking about their problems. They're thinking about how big of a priority is it. Should I put resources towards this? What's the timing on this? They're thinking through all of that before they lock their short list. Once they lock their short list, then they go into a validation state, right? And so I talked to a lot of CROs that are like, they know what they want by the time they want to talk to us, right? So our go-to-market strategy is turning into, though conversations are getting more and more validation oriented instead of earlier in impacting the way that they're thinking, right? And even in customer success, our key KPIs are cross-sell and upsell, right? And so we
Tension, yeah,
basically tend
NRR,
to,
yeah, of course, yeah.
yeah, and NRR, absolutely, absolutely. We tend to run our thinking through a sales lens. And so how do we, I had one four-time B2B CRO, he said, Steve, we've got to have a lot of conversations with our ideal customer profile outside of the sales process. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, right? Like
Yeah.
where do we get the learning and how do we get proactive about how we organize that and bring it into the organization?
I don't, you brought up, other CROs that, it through the process, right? The decision process for customers, you're part of the kind of consideration set, and then it gets down to validation, and you're probably negotiating terms and conditions and fees and things of that nature. So I think what you're talking about is how do you get way up funnel for that? I don't think we can just pretend that the sales funnel doesn't exist, right? You need some sort of framework to organize around. I think the question I'd ask is what is being done by the entire organization far upstream from that, right? If you just think about it from a deal perspective, how is the entire organization thinking about getting to know these customers, right? Getting to know everything from, and again, it depends on what your manufacturing and process and delivery is, like those kind of cycles. But if you're just talking about kind of very simple things, just widgets, does everybody in that C-suite really understand the customers, the ideal customer profile? Do they understand how their decisions then impact that ideal customer profile? And again, it's not the sole responsibility of the revenue organization, nor is it the sole responsibility of the marketing organization to drive inbound, all of these kind of facets. And so very rarely do you have, as you said, as 3%, do you have organizations that are properly organized around customers and around customer success and understanding these customers. I go back to what's the mandate of each person within that organization and each function within an organization, and how does it tie back to the customer? I think really successful leadership teams, especially at a C-suite, and it doesn't matter the size of the organization, they have those conversations weekly. They really try to understand the customer's perspective and where they can add value.
Really interesting because everything has to start at the C-suite level, right? And they have to drive then how the teams become high performance teams that drive the success of the business. So I don't know if you remember, but you and I, we had a call before, our recording here, and I asked you a question up front, and I asked it of every C-suite executive that comes onto the podcast, what do you think the two greatest challenges are for creating long-term sustainable growth? I've asked that about 125 times now. The number one challenge, which you just identified, is the lack of internal alignment. But
Mm-hmm.
you said, we have to come together regularly, like on basic things like ICP definition, right? And by coming together weekly, what you basically said there is we got to never stop talking about it, right?
Right. It's
We have
mindset,
to,
right? We talked about this. Yeah.
yes. So so that's the number one challenge. The number two challenge was a lack of deep understanding of the customer. I had two different C-suite executives that are now in go-to-market for B2B. They service B2B companies and their go-to-market strategies. And they all say internal alignment, number one problem. And the actual customer themselves is the largest change agent inside of the organization. That taking the voice of the customer is the number one way to bring alignment together, explain why and what we're doing it, give motivation to the teams, right? So why do you think it's so hard to do that? It seems pretty basic. Let's talk about the customer. Let's learn from the customer. Let's organize and let's disseminate and let's have a coordinated go-to-market strategy.
Yeah, I think again, I think it's a mindset, right? We talked about that and getting C-suite commitment and being able to talk about that from a mandate perspective. I think it's one. Two is the organization set up to have a real deep understanding of the customer, right? Or is everything flowing through a choke point, whether that's the partnerships team or the sales team that controls the information? I think in this day and age where we have so many tools and the ability to capture so much about our customers and then be able to distribute that, right? There's no reason that any individual, and regardless of the company and the size, if you have a decent collection, a repository of customer data, that person can't just go in and query that through an LLM and be able to better understand how they could think about what they can do. But if they're not given that kind of mandate and they don't think that they have the organizational support to do that, and they're not really clear about how they individually can ladder up into that solution, into that mandate, I think it's probably pretty challenging for that to happen. As CEOs can put in that mandate all they want, but if there's not the infrastructure, the organizational design, the resourcing, the tools, the incentives, people will just revert back to what is standard operating procedure. There are not change management is incredibly hard. So you're often better off just building this in from the get-go, which is obviously why Amazon's so successful. It's the way that, that Bezos built that business, is to be customer obsessed.
I had the good fortune of interviewing a customer experience person at Amazon. And I don't know if you ever heard of the Amazon empty chair policy,
Yes.
where, yeah, this back when we actually had only physical meetings, there was an empty chair that represented the customer. If the customer was
Right.
here with us, how would that impact the decisions we're making? And now it's a virtual chair. And she said, oh, it's very much alive within the organization. And it comes down to that mindset that you're talking about, right? We never stop thinking about whether it's a distribution, topic we're talking about, product, sales, an RFP we're responding to, whatever it is, we have to have that in mind, in that mindset. Now, so here's an interesting question. I'm going to guess you probably don't go into too many board meetings of the CRO and have them say, hey, how are we becoming more customer obsessed? How are we learning more about the company or the customer? You're probably getting questions more like, how's this quarter's quota going? What does next quarter look like? So the mindset isn't necessarily starting at the board. It doesn't always happen at the C-suite level either. How do we become, as C-suite executives listening to this podcast, how do we help become that change agent internally? How do we help create that mindset?
It starts first with being able to link it to the outcomes, right? Going through something in my own company at this moment, which shows both the opportunity of being customer obsessed and maybe where we maybe took our eye off the ball a little bit. Without going into specifics, It's an opportunity for us to demonstrate kind of almost an A/B test. When you're customer obsessed, this is what the outcome looks like. And when you're not, and you can literally see the attributes of the A/B test. Are you or are you not customer obsessed? And so I think it's really important if you talk about, again, who owns it, the revenue function owns it per se, but they also own the ability to get buy-in across the entire organization, as well as the board and stakeholders, shareholders, whomever that might be. It's super critical for the organizations and leaders to be able to demonstrate the impact, right? The cause effect of this particular approach, because otherwise it can sound rather ephemeral or difficult to pinpoint the impact. And from that perspective, I think it really sits with, in my case, me, to be able to demonstrate that as the CRO. I would go back and again look at, and again, I rely a lot on our LLM that we use that's able to mine our data and be able to draw out inferences from a bunch of what may be considered disparate data, and be able to ask these questions and be able to tell that story. Ultimately, I don't think you want to go, where it's too much cause and effect, but you can talk about the nuances of each perspective of customer obsession. How is that impacting your R&D, right? Depending on what business you're in, what industry you're in, where is the revenue organization and the voice of the customer as it plugs into R&D? How is product marketing working with product to represent the customer's interest? Who's meeting with the customers? How are they stress testing some theories and thoughts, but also managing customer expectations around the development of new products? So ultimately, as the revenue person, you've got to make sure, because if you think about it, you're responsible for growth, responsible for status quo, right? And growing revenue is a pretty straightforward thing. New customers, existing customers, and raising prices, the last one's incredibly hard to do. So how are we thinking about a deeper customer relationship, which contributes to NRR, recurring revenue, but it also contributes to product development, innovation. At my previous company, we built a great business, and most of it was just early on, because it was a newer category. It was in connected television. It was about just talking to people about what they were seeing. It was all really new ground for a lot of us. So we were trying to build our own ideas and approaches. And for that perspective, I talked to one person, oh, that's interesting. I talked to two people, like, oh, let's put some connection there. We can start to build a new offering, a new service, pilot it with them, and then be able to take that out and expand it. And it was all rooted in what those individual customers were seeing, and starting to see that through line. Some of the most successful CEOs in their first 90 days, obviously as a CRO, you do this, the CEOs go meet with every customer, and not just the one person who is the contract owner or the CEO of that company, but really throughout the entire organization, and just helping to understand, why as a company, why does our relationship matter? And those conversations can start to fill in the gaps a lot on the numbers that might sit on a revenue report or P&L statement or something like that.
I interviewed this woman. She's a 3-time B2B CMO, and she's a value accelerator advisor with Goldman Sachs. And she articulated, she said, we need to be spending 20% of our time as C-suite executives talking to customers. That was her kind of like bar. And she said her favorite question to ask was exactly from a little bit different perspective. Why does our relationship matter? She just asked the question, like, what do we do for you? Because we really think we know, right? We really think we know. But unless we ask that question, or why does what we do with you, why does it matter? We learn tremendous things, right? The idea of just getting out there and talking, if we're all out there talking and we're having individual conversations, I like to call it insight decay. So, like, how does it stop from just being in Michael's head or Steve's head, right?
Yeah.
And how does it make it out to the whole team? And you mentioned databases in connecting them, like to Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, whatever you use. And they're smart enough to know when they're given a certain prompt and they have a job to do, which database it's in, right? McKinsey said 90% of a company's data is unstructured. That to me says, and that means conversational data, right? And so we got to get really good at taking conversational data and making it available for Claude or Gemini or ChatGPTs because our teams are all on LLMs every day doing their part of the go-to-market strategy, right? How important is database management as a CRO to fit into this whole customer obsession, revenue logic conversation we're having here? Because that's the way that we're delivering our go-to-market these days. We're collaborating with Claude, right? And Gemini.
How critical is data management to a CRO? I would say how critical is a dashboard in an airplane to a pilot?
Oh, I love
Right?
it.
I mean, if you don't have the data, you don't have the instrumentation, how are you possibly running a business without
Right.
that? What gets measured gets improved, right? I do want to go back to the person that you mentioned and first off, give her tremendous kudos for having the courage to ask that question. Not many people do that. I challenge my sales leaders and our sellers to ask those tough questions. And fortune favors the bold, right? You're not going to grow and you're not going to have the opportunity to grow by not asking those tough questions. Sometimes you hear what you were hoping to hear, and sometimes you don't. But if you have a good enough relationship, hopefully you're getting the truth, or you're getting some version of the truth, or their version of the truth, which is the most important version of the truth that you need. It's only in those moments, right? It's only in those moments that you can really understand where you matter. We had somebody on the company I'm at now, their advisory board, our advisory board, who said, you know, you've made it when the CEO or the C-suite of your customer knows you, knows that you exist. And then you wonder how many companies out there just go by and are just part of the fabric and the wallpaper, if you will, of the business, but aren't material. There's no one in the C-suite going, gosh, if we lose them as a supplier, that's a really bad day. Those are the positions you want to be in. How do you get to that position? You really need to dig deep. It's not about relationships. Certainly relationships are part of building a business, but ultimately it's how much do you matter? How much do you matter to that business? I don't know how you do that without really understanding their business. And then I don't know how you do that with really out being able to measure that through instrumentation and, as I said, data.
Can I tell you a story? So it was a client who got acquired recently by NASDAQ, and they were in the investment management space. And we were asking that kind of question. And they said, what you're allowing us to do is get out of so much detailed data management work that we do with the managers at the firms that we work with that allows us to actually build a relationship with them instead of just constantly being so deep into the data and replying to investment RFPs and different things like that. It actually allows us to have conversations we never had time to ask before or
Yeah.
have. Now, that was not on the radar of the product roadmap. Right. But it was one of the biggest things. They said, we're a relationship management business. And we all are. Like we know how much relationships are important. But it allowed us to build relationships that we didn't have time to before.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. You gotta, those are the nuggets. Oh my goodness. Right. And
But
those are the things.
you also have to earn that, right? You have to earn that through, you have to earn that. Everybody's busy, and how people prioritize their time in a given day says a lot about where they think they're going to be able to win and have an impact. And if you're not prioritized, then clearly you haven't earned the right yet to have that conversation. And one goes, how do you go about doing that? It's little steps. It's being proactive, but it's also, I go back to being customer obsessed in my own life. And I just think about that when I'm on the other side and I'm buying things. Who do I gravitate to? It's people who can see the things that I can't see. They're experts. They're out to, not only help me seize opportunities, but also protect me. That's how I want our entire organization to think about our customers and to be truly customer obsessed.
I have to tell you, I haven't once looked at the discussion guide that we set out because we just started talking
Okay.
and it was great. So I want to ask this question as the last question because we've gone through so much here that if there was one thing that you wanted the C-suite audience that will be consuming this podcast to take away from our conversation today, what is that one most important thing that you want to leave them with?
I think that customer obsession isn't a consulting word or isn't taught necessarily in academic circles, but it is really an organic, living, breathing thing. It's not, hey, this quarter, we're going to be customer obsessed. It has to be fit into the fabric of everything you do. I don't know a business that doesn't have customers and isn't successful, right? And so if your success is really driven around how you deliver for customers, you can have a great operational efficiency. You can have great financial terms, but it all has to go back to delivering value for the customer. Why is that not the most important thing you'd organize around? And it's not that difficult. It really isn't. And as I said, Steve, first and foremost is like everything in life, you have to put a mindset to it and go, this is important. This is a priority. And this is how we're going to help our organization organize around this priority and seize this opportunity. I think that's the most exciting thing. And yes, it shows up in your revenue lines, but it also shows up in kind of the hearts and minds of your customers, and to know that the work that you're doing actually truly matters. And I can't think of a thing that gives people more purpose than understanding about how the work that they do impacts somebody else in a positive way. And that goes across, that's just generic and universal as a human condition.
Well, I got to tell you, that is a brilliant, takeaway. The goal of this podcast is to talk to C-suite executives all over the world that are all in a B2B, ABM, go-to-market motion and learn from our experiences, our perspectives, our insights, and what's worked and what hasn't. And if we can bring it all together and learn from each other, then that's the rising tide that lifts all boats. And you were amazing today as a part of that rising
That's great.
tide. I just want to say thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this. I wish all everybody listening to this all the best and great success with their customers.